more skeptical.
In fact, the reporting paints a picture in which Allied nations showed a staggering amount of mistrust about the credibility of U.S. intelligence. Some of the revelations are stunning, others sobering. Two of the reporters who led this investigation join us today. Isabel Kershudian is the Ukraine bureau chief with our editorial partner, The Washington Post. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Shane Harris is intelligence and national security reporter for The Post. Hi, Shane.
Hi, Celeste.
You know, what surprised me, Shane, was the scope of detail in U.S. intel that they had very early on. They seem to have access to many layers of classified Russian information, and they discovered what you and your partners described as a plan of staggering audacity, one that could even destroy the post-World War II security architecture of Europe. How did the U.S. get such accurate information?
Well, this was really a quite impressive feat by the U.S. intelligence community, which, as we write in the story, had penetrated every level, really, of Russia's military, political, diplomatic structure. They had satellite imagery, intercepted communications, information from human sources. It is surprising the volume of information that they were able to access, and what they ultimately did with this was put it together to try and paint a picture for policymakers of an imminent invasion. But the only thing they didn't know was when or if Vladimir Putin would actually order that and pull the trigger. But early on, it was just very clear to senior members of the Biden administration and people in the intelligence community that all of the pieces were being put in place, and the information that they found was so compelling that it led them to ultimately brief President Biden in October and say, essentially, we think this is real. We may be looking at a war in Ukraine.
So, Isabel, you were in Moscow at the time. There's been a lot of talk about the fact that there are Russian holes in the Ukraine government. Is it possible that there were human sources within the Russian government, maybe at high levels, who were speaking to the Americans?
Well, it certainly seems to be that way, not just in the Kremlin, but in the military command, all the way down to the front lines. And I think what's interesting is that we haven't seen Putin really make any big changes in his security services, really in his government. So we have to assume that, some of those sources are still there.
So, Shane, the intel was presented in a very careful way for both President Biden and Vice President Harris. How difficult was it to convince the president and vice president that this was serious?
I don't think it was ultimately that difficult because of just how compelling the intelligence was. And we know that as the picture developed too, the Americans were getting actual communications by people on the battlefield as well. I mean, they really were kind of inside the military command. So I think that President Biden understood and even talked a little bit about this publicly when he talked about what the intelligence capability was, that they were getting the spoken or the written words of the people who ultimately were putting these plans in place. And then all of us publicly did see a slice of this when satellite imagery, a lot of it from commercial providers that is put out on social media or that was reported in the press, showed these massive buildups of troops along the border, ammunition and supplies. And so I think that President Biden came to a pretty decisive conclusion. And from our reporting, he never wavered really off that. He always thought that the intelligence community was correct in its assessment that an invasion was more likely than not.
So it seems like this was a difficult message to relay, not only within the U.S., but also with European partners. And one of the concerns was about the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. Isabel, not only did the U.S. have concerns that Zelensky was not up to this challenge, but European partners were as well. Can you tell me a little bit about the view of Zelensky among NATO allies?
Yeah, we have to remember he didn't come to power from any kind of traditional background. He's pretty young, 44 years old, former comedian, and, was kind of swept into power really unexpectedly. And